Welcome back to the Deep Dive, listeners. We're diving deep into The Compassionate Mind by Paul Gilbert.
Ooh, interesting.
We've got some really fascinating excerpts from you guys
Oh, fantastic.
that explore compassion's influence in our lives. Everything from its evolutionary roots to, how it shapes our brains and relationships, the whole nine yards.
Well, and I think it's fascinating what you picked out because there's such an intriguing blend of, scientific perspectives, but also, insights from Buddhism, even dipping into Jungian psychology. It's not just about feeling good.
Right.
It's really about understanding the complex kind of dance between our primal instincts and our evolved capacities for compassion. I think it's like there's a caveman and a philosopher in our minds constantly having this debate.
Okay, I love that. So help me understand then, what exactly is this compassionate mind? Is this something we're born with or a skill we can hone over time?
Well, Gilbert argues that humans actually have a biological predisposition toward both compassion and kindness. And, if we think back to our evolutionary history, survival really depended on cooperation and caregiving. Affectionate bonds actually trigger those feel-good hormones, which reduce stress. And ultimately, that increases our chances of survival. It wasn't just about feeling warm and fuzzy. It was actually a matter of life and death.
So our desire for connection isn't, just a social media trend. You're saying it's literally embedded in our DNA.
Absolutely. And this need for care really impacts our neurological development. It shapes those brain regions associated with empathy and compassion. For example, studies on neglected children have actually revealed that a lack of affection can hinder the development of those crucial brain areas.
This raises an interesting question. So Gilbert talks about this old and new brain.
Hmm.
How do those fit into this picture?
Well, picture this. We all have this ancient, we'll call it the old brain. We inherited it from our ancestors, and we actually share it with many species. This is the part of us that drives primal instincts like fear and anger, the drive for resources. So this system is crucial for survival in threatening environments. Fuels those quick reactions like fight or flight.
Oh, so that's why it turned into a nervous wreck in traffic.
Right, exactly.
But where does this new brain come into play then?
Well, the new brain represents, our evolutionary leap forward. It's what enables, self-awareness, complex emotions like empathy, imagination. That's what really sets us apart from other animals.
Okay, so we have this, advanced new brain capable of profound empathy, but our primitive old brain can still hijack the system,
Right.
especially when we're stressed. Is that kind of the conflict that Gilbert's highlighting?
Precisely. So imagine your old brain like a toddler throwing a tantrum.
Okay.
It wants what it wants, and it wants it now. And sometimes that toddler takes over, and that leads to those self-sabotaging behaviors, those negative thought spirals we get in, or even, justifications for harmful actions, even though we know we have the capacity for empathy.
Okay, that's a powerful analogy. It's like our better angels are constantly wrestling with our inner caveman. But where does depression fit into all this?
Well, consider this. Depression from an evolutionary lens is actually an old brain response to a perceived threat.
Hmm.
It triggers this withdrawal instinct, similar to, like an animal retreating to safety. But here's the catch. Our self-awareness, a product of that new brain, causes us to dwell on these feelings. We're locking ourselves into this vicious cycle.
That's both fascinating and a little terrifying. So our capacity for higher thought it's also kind of what traps us in these negative spirals.
Exactly. And it brings us to, this remarkable power of imagination, which is another function of our new brain. Gilbert proposes that just as vividly imagining a delicious meal, can trigger physical sensations, so too can imagining acts of kindness stimulate our soothing system, promoting, feelings of calm and contentment.
Wait, so you're saying we can literally use our imaginations to cultivate compassion and well-being? What are some examples of how this might work in practice?
Well, consider techniques like, compassionate imagery. You visualize a safe, comforting place or an idealized compassionate figure.
Hmm.
Think of like a tranquil forest, a gentle hand on your shoulder. These practices actually have a tangible effect on reducing stress and promoting a sense of well-being. Gilbert's research has shown that.
I'm starting to see how this all kind of connects here. But to get even more specific, what are the core ingredients then that make up compassion?
Well, Gilbert breaks compassion down into four fundamental components.
Okay.
First, a genuine desire to care for the well-being of ourselves and others. Second, sensitivity to distress, allowing us to recognize and respond to suffering. Third, empathy, the ability to understand and share the feelings of others. And finally, tolerance and acceptance, learning to endure difficult emotions without judgment, paving the way for growth and healing.
So it's more than just a, fleeting feeling of sympathy. It's an active, engaged process that requires effort and intention.
Precisely. And these components are intertwined with practical practices that can help us cultivate compassion in our daily lives. Mindfulness, for instance, encourages us to pay attention to the present moment without judgment. And that includes our bodily sensations, our thoughts, and our emotions. Think of it like a mental pause button.
So mindfulness is about developing a non-judgmental awareness of our inner experience.
Right.
How does that contribute to compassion?
Well, by becoming more attuned to our own inner world, we actually develop a deeper understanding and acceptance of ourselves.
Hmm.
This, in turn, enhances our capacity for empathy and compassion toward others. It's like, tending to our own garden before we can help others tend to theirs.
It sounds like a journey of self-discovery,
Yeah.
leading to, greater understanding and compassion for both ourselves and those around us.
Exactly. And then there's, compassionate writing where we explore our feelings and experiences through journaling. This can further enhance self-understanding and emotional processing.
Like giving ourselves a safe space to examine and process our emotions, leading to greater self-compassion.
Mm.
But how do we address those negative thoughts that often intrude?
Well, Gilbert stresses the importance of challenging negative self-talk. This is a common obstacle to self-compassion.
Right.
So it involves identifying and reframing those self-critical voices, replacing them with kindness and understanding. Instead of berating ourselves for mistakes, we practice constructive self-correction. It's about treating ourselves with the same kindness and understanding we offer a close friend.
What really caught my attention in Gilbert's work is his exploration of our capacity for cruelty.
Mm.
He seems to suggest that confronting this darker side of ourselves is crucial to developing genuine compassion. It's a paradoxical, isn't it?
It is. Gilbert challenges us to acknowledge the full spectrum of human experience, including those aspects we might find unpleasant or even shameful. He argues that true compassion requires confronting our capacity for cruelty, understanding that it often stems from our primal instincts for self-preservation. It's like acknowledging the shadows within us so we can learn to integrate them with greater awareness and compassion.
It's a humbling thought that to truly embrace compassion, we must acknowledge our capacity for both good and evil. This deep dive into the compassionate mind has been truly insightful. Before we wrap up part one, let's just summarize a few key takeaways for you to ponder. First, humans are biologically wired for compassion and kindness, and these qualities significantly benefit well-being.
Second, our brains consist of old and new systems. The old drives primal instincts, while the new allows for complex thought.
Third, conflict arises when the old brain hijacks the new, leading to negative patterns and self-sabotage.
Fourth, imagination, a function of the new brain, can be used to stimulate soothing brain systems through compassionate imagery.
Fifth, compassion involves a desire to care, sensitivity to distress, empathy, and tolerance for difficult emotions.
Sixth, mindfulness practice helps us pay attention to the present moment without judgment, facilitating greater self-awareness.
Seventh, compassionate writing enables us to explore our feelings and experiences in a safe space, promoting emotional processing.
Eighth, challenging negative self-talk means replacing self-criticism with kindness, understanding, and constructive self-correction.
Ninth, engaging in compassionate imagery, such as visualizing a safe place, can activate the soothing system and promote well-being.
And finally, 10th, true compassion requires confronting our capacity for cruelty and accepting all parts of ourselves.
We'll delve even deeper into these concepts in part two. Stay tuned for more.
So in our previous segment, we really delved into this intricate interplay between our evolved old brain and our advanced new brain. But let's shift our attention now to this fascinating concept of social mentalities, these ingrained patterns of relating that deeply impact how we interact with others and ultimately influence our capacity for compassion.
Social mentalities. Okay,
Yeah.
that's a new one for me. Can you unpack that concept a bit further?
Sure. Gilbert identifies three primary social mentalities woven into our evolutionary history. We have the drive to compete, the instinct to cooperate, and the desire to care for others. These deep-seated patterns, shaped by millions of years of evolution, significantly impact, how we perceive the world, relate to others, navigate those social dynamics.
So we're essentially operating with this internal tug of war between, competition, cooperation, and caregiving impulses. How does that struggle within us affect our ability to be compassionate?
Well, let's consider our competitive mentality.
Hmm.
It compels us to strive for status, resources, recognition, often at the expense of others. It's that primal survival of the fittest instinct. So it fuels, this desire to outperform, to dominate. While this mentality might be beneficial for individual success in certain contexts, it can hinder compassion by fostering, comparison, judgment, and the sense of separateness from others.
Makes sense. If we're always focused on being better than everyone else, it's hard to genuinely care about their well-being.
Mhm.
What about the cooperative mentality then? How does that factor in?
Well, as the name implies, the cooperative mentality emphasizes collaboration, shared goals.
Right.
This social instinct has been crucial for group survival, enabling us to pool resources, work together, build communities. It fosters that sense of interconnectedness and mutual support, which aligns quite beautifully, I think, with compassion's emphasis on recognizing our shared humanity.
So the cooperative mentality kind of lays the groundwork then for compassion to flourish.
Mhm.
We're more inclined to care for those we consider part of our group. But what about that third instinct, the caregiving mentality?
The caregiving mentality is perhaps most closely linked to compassion. This social instinct evolved to ensure the survival of our offspring.
Hmm.
So it drives us to nurture, protect, and provide for those who depend on us. This innate drive to care often extends beyond our immediate family, creating, a ripple effect of compassion that can even reach strangers.
I'm starting to see how these three social mentalities, competition, cooperation, and caregiving, they're all kind of interacting within us constantly, shaping our actions and relationships. But how do we navigate this complex interplay to cultivate greater compassion in our lives?
Well, awareness is key. Recognizing which social mentality is driving our thoughts and behaviors in any given moment empowers us to make conscious choices that align with our values. If we find ourselves consumed by competitive urges, for example, we can utilize, mindfulness techniques to shift our focus to cooperation and caregiving.
So it's about catching ourselves when those competitive impulses take over and actively choosing a more compassionate path. Do you have any suggestions for how we can actually do that in our daily lives?
Well, think about those situations where you might feel triggered to compete or compare yourself to others.
Mm.
Maybe it's at work, in social settings, even within your own family. Practice noticing those feelings of envy, judgment, insecurity as they arise.
So the first step is awareness, becoming attuned to those competitive impulses without judging ourselves. What happens next?
Once you've identified those triggers, you can consciously reframe your perspective. Instead of viewing others as rivals, try envisioning them as potential collaborators or recipients of your care. Look for opportunities to support, encourage, or simply offer a kind word. These small acts of kindness can gradually shift your social mentality from competition to compassion.
These are incredibly helpful insights. It seems like consciously choosing compassion can transform our relationships and create a more caring world. I'm curious, though, how do these deep-seated, often unconscious social mentalities connect to our new brain functions, like imagination and self-awareness?
That's a great question. It leads us to this fascinating intersection of our evolved past and our conscious present. Our social mentalities, those ancient patterns of relating, can actually influence how our new brain functions manifest. For example, if we're dominated by that competitive mentality, our imagination might be hijacked to create scenarios of scarcity, comparison, and self-doubt.
So we might end up creating these worst-case scenarios in our minds, constantly comparing ourselves to others and fueling those anxieties based on this competitive mindset. No wonder we're all so stressed out. How do we break free from this negative cycle?
Well, Gilbert suggests using our imagination constructively, aligning it with compassion rather than competition. Instead of conjuring up images of lack and inadequacy, we can visualize scenarios of abundance, cooperation, shared success. We can picture ourselves offering kindness to others and receiving kindness in return, fostering that sense of interconnectedness.
Like we're retraining our imaginations to create a more compassionate internal world. That's a
Yeah.
powerful concept. But where does self-awareness fit into this interplay between social mentalities and compassion?
Well, self awareness is crucial for recognizing when our social mentalities are driving our behaviors in unhelpful ways. It allows us to step back from those automatic reactions and choose a more compassionate response. For instance, if we're aware of our tendency to get defensive when criticized, we can practice pausing before reacting, allowing space for empathy and understanding.
So self-awareness acts as this internal compass,
Yeah.
guiding us towards more compassionate choices, even when our primal instincts are pulling us in a different direction.
Exactly. And this is where those components of compassion we discussed earlier, a desire to care, sensitivity to distress, empathy, and tolerance, become vital tools for navigating the complexities of our social interactions. By cultivating these qualities, we can start disentangling ourselves from those ingrained patterns of relating that hinder compassion.
It's like we're rewriting the script of our social interactions, replacing those outdated competitive narratives with a more compassionate approach. This deep dive into the compassionate mind is providing a profound roadmap for personal and societal transformation. I'm curious about the link to spirituality, though. Gilbert seems to draw these connections between compassion and spiritual traditions, especially Buddhism. Can you elaborate on that connection?
Gilbert highlights these remarkable parallels between the principles of compassion outlined in his work and those found in Buddhist teachings, particularly the concept of mindfulness.
Oh,
Buddhism stresses the cultivation of, non-judgmental awareness of our thoughts, feelings, and sensations, a practice closely aligned with Gilbert's approach to developing compassion.
so so both Gilbert and Buddhist teachings are advocating for mindfulness as this pathway to greater compassion. Are there any other areas where those approaches converge?
Absolutely. Both emphasize the interconnectedness of all beings, the understanding that our individual well-being is intertwined with the well-being of others. This sense of shared humanity fosters a natural inclination toward compassion, motivating us to care for others as we would care for ourselves.
Fascinating how these scientific and spiritual perspectives intersect on the importance of compassion. But what about those who might be skeptical of spirituality or religion? Is compassion still accessible to them?
Of course, Gilbert stresses that compassion is a universal human capacity, accessible to everyone regardless of their spiritual beliefs or affiliations.
Mhm.
It's a natural instinct that can be cultivated through mindfulness, self-awareness, and the conscious choice to engage with the world in a more caring way.
That's comforting to hear. Compassion isn't limited to those who follow a particular belief system. It's an inherent human quality we can all nurture. But how does this translate into practical action? How do we apply these principles of compassion in our daily lives?
Well, Gilbert offers a multitude of practical practices for fostering compassion, many of which we've already touched upon. Mindfulness, compassionate writing, challenging negative self-talk, engaging in compassionate imagery. These are all valuable tools for cultivating greater kindness toward ourselves and others.
These are fantastic starting points.
Yeah.
What about those situations where we encounter individuals who seem resistant to compassion? Perhaps those who've harmed us or hold beliefs that we find, abhorrent. How do we extend compassion in those difficult circumstances?
Well, that's where this concept of radical compassion comes in.
Radical compassion.
It's the ability to offer kindness even to those who seem undeserving. This doesn't mean condoning harmful actions or compromising our values. Rather, it involves recognizing the shared humanity of even those who've caused us pain,
Yeah.
understanding that their behaviors often stem from their own suffering.
So acknowledging the pain and suffering that might be driving their actions without excusing their behavior. It's a challenging concept, but one that feels essential for creating a truly compassionate world. But I wonder, how do we balance this radical compassion with our need for self-protection? Is there a risk of becoming too forgiving, too accommodating of harmful behavior?
That's an important question, and it underscores the need for wisdom and discernment when practicing compassion. Gilbert emphasizes that compassion does not equate to weakness or passivity.
Right.
We can set boundaries, protect ourselves from harm, and hold others accountable for their actions while still maintaining a compassionate stance.
So it's about finding that delicate balance between compassion and self-preservation, offering kindness without jeopardizing our own well-being.
Exactly. And this is where the concept of fierce compassion comes into play.
Fierce compassion.
The ability to stand up for ourselves and others, to challenge injustice and work towards creating a more just and compassionate world, even when it requires courage and difficult choices.
It's a potent reminder that compassion isn't always soft or passive. It can be this catalyst for positive change, motivating us to challenge systems and behaviors that perpetuate suffering.
Absolutely. And this brings us back to those evolutionary roots of compassion. We've evolved to care for others, to cooperate, to create communities that promote well-being. These instincts are deeply ingrained in our biology. And by tapping into this innate capacity for compassion, we can create a world that reflects our highest human potential.
This deep dive into the compassionate mind is providing this profound reframing of how we view ourselves, our relationships, our place in the world. It's a call to action, urging us to embrace compassion as a driving force for personal and societal transformation.
As we transition into part three, we'll explore the practical applications of compassion even further, examining specific techniques and strategies for cultivating greater kindness in all areas of our lives.
So in this final part of our exploration into the compassionate mind, let's really dive into some practical techniques and strategies for cultivating greater kindness in our everyday lives. We've already discussed fundamental practices like mindfulness and compassionate writing, challenging those inner critics. But Gilbert offers just this wealth of additional tools for nurturing compassion.
One particularly potent technique he emphasizes is compassionate imagery, harnessing the power of our imaginations to evoke those sensations of warmth, safety, and connection. We touched on this a little bit earlier, but I think it's worth exploring further.
I'm really intrigued by this concept of using our imaginations to cultivate compassion. Can you walk us through how that works in practice?
Well, imagine those moments when you're feeling, stressed, anxious, maybe just overwhelmed. Instead of allowing yourself to be swept away by those difficult emotions, you can consciously choose to engage in this compassionate imagery. Close your eyes, take a few deep, calming breaths, and conjure up this image of a place where you feel safe, comfortable, utterly at ease.
It's almost like creating this mental sanctuary, a refuge, where we can retreat to find solace and inner peace. What types of images might be helpful in creating that space?
Well, the specific imagery can vary from individual to individual, but common themes often revolve around, natural settings like tranquil forests or pristine beaches, majestic mountains. You might picture yourself surrounded by loved ones, or perhaps envision a wise, compassionate figure offering solace and support.
So we can draw upon, personal memories, spiritual figures, or even, archetypal imagery to construct this compassionate haven. It's about discovering what resonates most deeply within us.
Exactly. And the real key to this practice is to engage all your senses in this imagery. So don't just visualize the scene, but really try to feel the warmth of the sun caressing your skin, hear those soothing melodies of nature's symphony, inhale the fragrance of blooming flowers, savor the sweetness of the air. By immersing yourself completely in this sensory experience, you amplify the calming, restorative impact of compassionate imagery.
It's like creating this full-bodied immersion in compassion, engaging our minds, our bodies, and our spirits in this practice. But how can we utilize compassionate imagery when we're grappling with those moments of intense self-criticism or negativity?
Well, Gilbert suggests employing compassionate imagery to directly confront those harsh inner critics. Remember that wise, compassionate figure we discussed earlier.
Hmm.
Now visualize them offering you words of kindness, understanding, encouragement, effectively counteracting those negative judgments you might be directing towards yourself.
It's like using compassionate imagery to reparent ourselves, offering the nurturing and support that we may have lacked in our early experiences. Such a profound concept.
It is. By consistently engaging in this practice, we can gradually rewire our brains to respond to those challenges with self-compassion rather than self-criticism. Another potent technique Gilbert advocates for is compassionate letter writing.
Compassionate letter writing. Okay, now you've got my attention. Tell me more about how that technique works.
Well, think about those times when you felt hurt, betrayed, or wronged by someone. Perhaps, a friend, a family member, a colleague. Instead of letting those feelings of anger, resentment, or bitterness fester, consider writing a compassionate letter to that individual.
So the intention isn't necessarily to actually send this letter, but to use it as a tool for processing our emotions and fostering greater compassion.
Exactly. The objective is not to condone their actions or excuse their behavior, but rather to shift our perspective from blame and judgment to understanding and empathy.
How do we even begin to write such a letter? What elements might we want to incorporate?
Well, start by acknowledging the pain their actions inflicted upon you. Articulate your feelings honestly and openly, but try to avoid accusatory language. Then, attempt to shift your focus towards understanding their perspective. You know what circumstances in their life might have contributed to their behavior.
So stepping into their shoes, attempting to see the situation from their vantage point, does this imply condoning their actions, though?
Not at all. The aim is not to justify their behavior, but to cultivate a deeper understanding of the complexities that might have influenced their actions. We can recognize their shared humanity, their struggles, their pain without condoning the harm they caused.
It's a delicate tightrope walk, but one that seems so essential for cultivating genuine compassion. What else might we include in a compassionate letter?
You might consider expressing your hopes for their well-being, even if you're still grappling with hurt or anger. You can also explore avenues for moving forward in the relationship if that feels appropriate. Often, the simple act of composing the letter is enough to release some of that emotional weight and shift your perspective.
It's a remarkable method for practicing forgiveness, not just for the other person, but for ourselves as well. By releasing that grip of resentment, we create space for healing. These techniques, compassionate imagery and compassionate letter writing, offer these tangible tools for nurturing kindness in our daily lives. But what about, the larger context? How can we foster a more compassionate society, particularly in a world that's often dominated by, competition, division, and conflict?
Well, that's the ultimate aspiration, isn't it? Gilbert reminds us that building a compassionate society begins with individual transformation, radiating outward to influence our families, our communities, and ultimately the world at large.
So it's a grassroots endeavor, starting with individual change and then expanding outward. What are some practical steps we can take to contribute to a more compassionate world?
Well, Gilbert encourages us to cultivate greater awareness of the systems and structures that perpetuate suffering, whether it's poverty, inequality, environmental degradation. We can support organizations that are dedicated to addressing these issues, advocate for policies that promote justice and well-being, and make conscious choices in our daily lives that align with our values.
It's about recognizing our interconnectedness, understanding that our actions, however seemingly insignificant, ripple outward to affect the world around us. Each of us can be an agent of compassion, contributing to the creation of a more just and caring society.
Exactly. And remember those social mentalities we talked about?
Right.
We can consciously choose to cultivate the cooperative and caregiving mentalities, fostering collaboration, kindness, and a sense of shared humanity.
It's a paradigm shift, redirecting our focus from competition and self-interest to cooperation and collective well-being. This deep dive into the compassionate mind has been just such an illuminating exploration of compassion's power, both within us and in the world around us. It's this call to action, inspiring us to embrace kindness as this guiding principle in every facet of our lives.
As we conclude our deep dive, I just want to reiterate this crucial point. Compassion isn't a destination to be reached, but an ongoing journey. It's a practice we can nurture each and every day through those small gestures of kindness, mindful awareness, and this steadfast commitment to creating a more just and compassionate world.
Well, thank you for joining us on this profound exploration of the compassionate mind. May we all continue to cultivate those seeds of compassion, nurturing kindness within ourselves, and extending it outward to illuminate the world.